Hello friends, thank you for watching this video. I am Mohamad and today we're going to be discussing why do we need to make our APIs more robust and more reliable. We're going to be going through the thinking process of why do we need to do this, as well we're going to be going through the code and see how we can actually implement it. So let's get started. So first of all, let's try to design our APIs, and once we design it, we're going to see the potential failure points that we actually might face when we're creating our APIs and then how we can actually resolve them. So what I need here is first a user, and this user is going to be my normal user who's going to be consuming my API. So I'm going to put here a server, and this here we're going to have a server, and this server is going to be where my API is, and this user here is going to be doing some API calls, and these API calls, they're going to be going directly to the server. So the server by itself, where my API lives, it could have different services that it's actually relying on. It could have, for example, another API, so it could be relying on extracting data from another API. So that could be one single endpoint where this server is actually getting its information from. We could have another database, so let's put a database here. We might even have a different third API. So it's going to be one API, a second one, and here we're just going to put a database. Okay, perfect. And now this is going to be my main entry point for my API, where basically any single request the user will make, it will have to go through this, and then it will go to all of the subsequent service. So for example, this is a very normal API scenario where you have different third-party solutions relying on. So this could be, for example, a currency conversion. This could be, for example, authentication, and this could be where actual, let's say, users' data, any types of data we need. So what happened, for example, if my user trying to log in or basically do any calls for my API, once the request hits my API is trying to do an authentication API, and this is not working for any reason. This connections between my API as well as my main API, I'm gonna call this main API so avoid confusion. So between my main API and my authentication API is broken. So the normal scenario right now is we're going to be sending back a 500 or a problem error or please try again later to the user. But that's not really a good way of implementing this, because basically what we need to be able to do is we need to basically let the main API handle the retries of all of our API calls. It needs to be able to actually detect what type of error the API is sending back, and based on those errors that we are getting back, it will be able to decide on what it needs to do in order for it to progress further. So it could do some retries multiple times. It could either, for example, wait for a bit of time and then do the call again. So all of those needs to be decided by the main API, rather than every single time this request, when it goes from the, let's put here, so let's say here we have one, this is gonna be my main, I'm gonna give it a nice green color. So once we're going from the request from the user to the API, and then from the API to our service, and then all the way back. So rather than having to rely on this chain of requests every single time there's a failure, what we need to do is we need to limit this interaction between the main API and the authentication API, so are basically where the user will not know what's going on, or basically the user is gonna assume everything is going on normally and everything is actually progressing as it should. We're not gonna be like informing the user, okay, our third-party service is not working, or basically there's a problem with our authentication service, or for any of that. So what we need to do here is, in order for us to make sure that the main API is able to handle all of these different errors, there's different scenarios. So the first one that we might to implement is going to be a retry policy. And a retry policy means here that if I do a call to a third-party API, or if I do a call to any API and this call fail, I'll basically, what the name says here is I do a retry on this. So for example, let's say I do a call to my authentication, it gives me like a 500 error. As soon as I see that the request was not successful, I do another retry. If I get back, I do another retry, and so on and so forth. But for example here, doing a retry policy with having a full retry policy, this might overwhelm the other authentication service or the authentication API, because basically if I'm trying right now, what I'm trying to do is unwillingly I'm doing DDoS attack on that API, because I'm keep on retrying and getting a failure, keep on retrying and getting a failure. So we need to have some kind of an implementation within my retry policy to say, okay, listen, I'm gonna have, for example, 5 retries, and these 5 retries, they'll have to wait between every single retry. I have to wait like an incremental amount of time, like 3 seconds. So what does that mean? So for example, that will lead us to something like this. I'm gonna have the first time the user is gonna do a call and they're gonna face an error, they're gonna have to wait a 5-second time. So they're gonna have wait 5 seconds. So here, this is the count of the calls, and this is gonna be the waiting time. So now that the first time I do a call to my API, it fails, I have to wait 5. And now whenever I want to do my second call, if it fails, now this has to be a 10-second wait. Again, if this has to be another time I need to do a call, so this becomes 3, and this will become a 15-second wait. So as you can see here, I'm doing an incremental increase of waiting time based on 5. Every time there's a failure, etc., etc. So as you can see, this is going to be the mapping of a retry with a backup policy. So I'm telling it that, okay, you need to retry to do the request that has failed, but you need to wait a certain amount of time before you can actually retry, because while we're waiting, that API can actually recover itself. So either it has a new deployment that needs to finish, or either it's being restarted and it needs all of its services to be up and running, and all of those might take between milliseconds up to like 10 seconds for it to be fully running. So if we try to bombard it every single time, we're going to be facing a lot of problems. But if we're doing this calls to our APIs with a retry policy and a backup policy, we're actually able to save our third-party service while actually persisting the connection to that with our user, in order for us to have a very much smooth journey for our user, rather than every single time telling them, oh, it fails, please try again later. Oh, it failed, please try again later. We can see this is not a really good way to interact with our users. So now that we have understood the main concept of this, let us see how we can actually implement it within our code. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating a new .NET application or a new API, and we're going to be connecting to a third-party service in order for us to try to mimic this. And the third-party service that we're going to be utilizing, it's a Rapid API endpoint for Chuck Norris jokes. It's a pretty straightforward API that we can actually integrate, and whenever, for example, we need a request, we're going to be able to get a lot of responses back, and we're going to be trying to mimic this interaction between two different APIs whenever a user tries to do this. So it's a pretty straightforward implementation. So inside my terminal, all I'm going to be doing here is .NET new web API dash controllers. I'm going to give it a name, sample API. Let's make this a bit bigger, and I knew I forgot the space. So let's put enter. Now we can see it creates successfully. Now let's open this in Rider. Okay, great. So now my application has opened. What I need to do is I'm going to open my terminal, and I want to install a couple of packages. Let me make this a bit bigger. And the first one is going to be a .NET add package, and it's going to be Poly. And Poly is basically a library which allows us to actually handle those retries, handle this backup policy. It's a very popular library. It's very powerful. We're going to be taking some of its functionality today and implementing it. But Poly, it's a completely different world where you can actually implement a lot of cool things within it. But today we're going to be taking a more of a conservative approach to Poly. The second one is going to be .NET. Let's clear this up. And we're going to put .NET add package REST chart. And this allows us to actually do calls to our third-party APIs quite easily. So now that both of them have been installed successfully, let me just clear this up again, and I'm gonna go right click here, and I'm gonna click on edit and edit CS Proj, and I just want to make sure that everything is installed. We can see Poly is here and REST Sharp is here. Okay, perfect. So now that we have covered this, the next point that I want to do is I'm gonna now start implementing my controllers. So the easiest way to do this, I'm gonna create, actually let me copy this and we'll create a new controller out of it. I'm gonna call this services, services controller, and click on OK. Now all I need to do is just replace this with services, and we should be up and running. Services, 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 and services. Okay, perfect. I don't need this, so we can remove it, and I don't need this, so we can remove. So now I have basically my API up and running, or basically my controller is ready for me to actually start to add some of the endpoints that I need. So the first endpoint that I need to do is a very simple GET request. So I'm gonna put here HTTP GET, and it's gonna be public. Let's do it async task action result, and here I'm gonna call it GET. Pretty straightforward. And what I want to do here is I want to implement my call to my API. So let me go back to my web browser. So I want to implement these calls between my API and authentication without actually having any retry policy. We're gonna see how that will work, and then we're gonna be seeing how we can actually introduce the retry policy with Poly there. So in order for me to know how to do this, I'm gonna be utilizing REST Sharp. And the nice thing about REST Sharp, if you go here, go to Rapid API, and if you click on the right hand side, you can see all of the languages that it will give you sample code. And if you click on C#, you can see that there's a sample code for REST Sharp, which is what we want. So the first thing here, I'm going to define my URL. Let me take this URL here. Okay, perfect. The next thing, I need to define a client. Great. And now I need to define a request. And here it's going to take the URL as well as the request type. So I'm going to say method.get. So now if I take a look at my documentation, we can see here we're doing get, and this is my API endpoint. Okay, perfect. So another thing we can see here that's actually requiring headers. So let me copy these so we can add them as a header. And one of them is for authentication, and the other one in order for us to know which endpoint that we're going to be utilizing from within our header. browser. So here I'm just gonna add this, and these basically gonna be my keys and my host that I'm gonna be utilizing. Okay, perfect. Once I have added these, and now I can see that I'm almost done, I'm gonna put var response equal await client dot execute async, and we're gonna execute the request that I have. And now here all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say if response dot is successful, I'm gonna return okay with the response dot content. Else what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna return bad request, and I'm gonna put the HTTP status code, or basically I'm gonna return a bad request and I'm gonna return the response dot error message that the API has returned. And that way basically I will be able to see if anything went wrong. So all I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna run my code, and now I'm gonna open it up in my web browser. As we can see, we have our services, try it out, execute, and if we come here, we can see it's not successful. So if we take a look at the response, we can see here, let's take a look at the error, application error. So that means that the API is not actually working, but we can see something here that the actual error is being inside the content rather than the error message. So let's update this. So I'm gonna stop this, and I'm gonna put here content. So let's try this again, and let's do our API calls, execute, and we can see we got this error, and this is an API error, something we cannot control from our side. Even if we click here on the test endpoint, we can see it's still not working. So let's use a different API, and let's use the movie database API rather than actually utilizing the Chuck Norris one. So this sometimes happens when we're trying to build work with free APIs. So just in case you're trying to utilize rapid APIs, this is something that you might face. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna also do the same thing. I'm gonna go to code snippet. I'm gonna go to C#, REST char, and then from there I'm just gonna copy my URL that I'm gonna utilize and update my current code. So let's go back to Rider, stop my application, hide this. I'm gonna update this, and this is gonna be my new movie database set, and I'm gonna take these two and put them here. Okay, perfect. And yeah, that's it. So what I'm gonna do here, as you can see on the left hand side for rapid API, for the movies one, we have a lot of different endpoints. And here you can see you can search by titles, title randoms. Let's do the random one. I think it's a bit better for us. And I'm gonna copy this and just put it here instead of title. And now let's run this and execute it. So I'm gonna run this, and let's go back to my web browser, and I'm gonna refresh this series, try it out, execute. Services, sorry. Random titles can only be used with a list. See, there's always something. So let's remove the random and keep it as is. Stop and try again. But at least now we can see that we're actually connecting to the API. So now let's do an execute again. And as you can see here, I got a lot of different information from my API regarding different series. We can see the link to it. So if I try to copy this, let's open it up in a web browser. Let's see what do we got. And here you can see, for example, I got this random series with its poster. So that's all good and well, and we can see that everything is working. Now what I want to do is I'm going to turn off my internet connection, and that's going to be basically saying that we had a problem communicating between our main API, which is running locally, and my movie API, which is going to be, I'm going to put this movies, my movies API, which is going to be on a server somewhere. And this should basically give me like a 500 error or something is not right. So I'm just going to turn off this, and I'm going to go back to Swagger, and I'm going to try to execute again. And now we can see that I got basically an error 400 bad request, and basically that means that something is not right. So what I want to do right now is let me put back my internet connection. I'm going to try it again, and now we can see here that I got back the response. So what I want to do right now is I want to start implementing the retry policies. So let's see how we can do that. So inside Rider, I'm going to stop my application. First thing that I want to do is I want to move this into its own unique method. So I'm just going to remove this. I'm going to create a new method. I'm going to say public async task. I'm going to call it connect to API, to movies API, to series API, and all it's gonna do is just do these calls. And all we're gonna be doing here is we're gonna update this to return boolean, and here we're gonna be returning the response. Actually, to make this a bit simpler and easier, all we're gonna be doing is returning as a string. Let's put this here back, and we're gonna be returning the response. So that way we're returning whatever response that we're getting back. So now what I want to do here is I want to call this method. So now if I do this and I call this method and I make it as an await, and the response, I'm going to put var response equal, and then all I'm going to do is return okay response. Again, this is not the best way, but this is just so we can see how that will work. Actually, we can even make it a bit nicer by returning the rest response. So let's redo that. Let's return the full rest response. And here what we can do is if response dot is successful, we'll return this dot message dot content, else we'll return bad request with the content. Okay, perfect. Now let's run this and see what are we gonna be getting. So this is building. Okay, perfect. Now it's running. Let's go back to my web browser and I'm gonna click on execute again. Now we can see it's still working as it should. Perfect. So now that we have done this, now let's implement the retry policy that we said we want to do. And all I'm gonna be doing here is I'm gonna be introducing poly. And the way poly is gonna be working is we need to introduce policies. And these policies will basically like a rule set that my application needs to abide by. And these rules that we're gonna define if you get an error, how many times you need to retry, etc., etc. And poly makes it really easy for us to create these rule set or these policy inside our application for us to actually utilize them. So let's see how we can do this. So now what I want to do here is inside my action, I'm gonna create my policy or my rule set. And this is gonna be var retry policy equal policy dot handle. I'm gonna say handle any exception, and then I'm gonna say here that it needs to do retries async, and here I'm gonna specify what it needs to do. When there's a retry, we can see there's different implementation. I'm just going to utilize the retry count with an action, so we can see we need to specify the exception and then int number. So this is the one that I want to utilize, so I'm going to put here 5 times, and then I want to specify the exception and the retry, and then I'm going to basically do an implementation. Let us fix this, and then here all I'm going to do is console dot write line. I'm going to say let's use string interpolation. There's an error. I'm going to specify the error based on the exception that I got, dot message, and then here I'm gonna put the retry count. Okay, perfect. So here, as we can see, pretty easily what I did is I defined a policy, and this policy I'm saying you need to handle any exception that happens, and within this exception that's actually happening, do a retry, and this is going to be the amount of retries that it needs to do. And on retry, what it needs to do is it needs just to print something out so we can see it's actually doing the retry. So this will mean that we need to do some changes into our connect to series API in order for us to actually try to throw exception rather than just returning a graceful error. So let's see how we can do that. So let's go to this method here. I'm gonna change it to string again, and what I want to do here is I'm gonna say if response dot is successful, I'm gonna return the response dot content, else I'm gonna throw an error, throw new exception. Well, I'm gonna put here in the message, I'm gonna put the response dot content that the API has returned, and I don't need to this anymore. Actually, let's put this like this. This will be a bit better. Okay, perfect. And here let us update this. So now all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the string, return okay, and with the response. But now that we have adjusted this in order for it to cater for this, let us see how we can attach this retry policy to this API call. And this is gonna be pretty straightforward. So now let's see how easy it is to convert this into utilizing the poly policy. I'm gonna put var result. Actually, let's keep this as is response, and then we can change it. So var response equal retry policy dot execute async, and here all I'm gonna put is gonna be an async, and this async approach is gonna execute the await dot connect to series API, and then here I need to put the semicolon at the end, and I'm just gonna remove this because we're already doing it through retry policies. So now all I'm gonna be doing here right here is I'm gonna execute this, and now if you go back to my web browser, I'm gonna click on execute. We need to await this. Apologies, I did not await it. So let's try this again. And let's go back to my web browser and click on retry. And now we can see we got the response back. Now let me turn off my internet connection, and I'm gonna click on execute. And now if we go back here to my console, before we have executed multiple times, we can see here that inside my console we did a retry 1, 2, 3, and this was like a direct retry, like 1, 2, one after the other. We did not do any waiting. So let's see how we can implement this waiting mechanism in order for us to have a bot for more incremental time in order for us to wait for these responses, and this should be pretty easy to implement. Coming back here, I'm going to stop my application, and the first thing that I need to do is I need to introduce the period of time that I wanted to wait. I'm gonna put here var amount to wait, and this is gonna be a span, time span dot from seconds, and I want to choose is gonna be, let's say, 10 seconds. So that's the first item. Then what I need to do is I need to update this in order for it to not only do retry, it needs to be retry and wait. So I'm gonna put retry wait and retry async. And then here what I need to do is I need to specify the amount it needs to do that. And I'm gonna put AI, and this is gonna be the sleep duration. As we can see, I'm gonna put here amount of time to wait. And now basically what I'm doing here is I'm telling poly that every single time it fails, it needs to return it, it needs to retry 5 times, and it needs to wait this amount of time, which is going to be 10 seconds, and then it needs to retry, and if there's any error, it needs to do this. And we can see how easy that was in order for us to implement a retry policy with back off. So now let's run this again, and if I go to my web browser, and don't forget my internet is still off, so that means that I should not be able to execute, but we need to able to wait before we can get the final error. So I'm gonna click on execute again, go to here, and as we can see here, error, retry, and we are waiting. And then after 10 seconds, we're gonna be seeing another error popping up that still is not able to connect. And once it does that, I'm gonna connect to my internet so it will be able to execute. And now we should be able to see that once it's going to execute the third retry, we were able to get the final information, or basically the final result that we needed. So here we can see how we implemented an await, where basically we have waited for almost 20 seconds until our connection to the service has been restored, and then we were able to actually execute the final response that we need, or basically get the final response that we needed. This was an introduction of how we can create a robust API and how we can create a more of a sustainable experience for our users. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments down below. If you'd like to support me, please consider supporting me on Patreon or buying me a coffee. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.